Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Julian Le Grand, and I will be chairing this event. The event itself is to mark the publication of the Conservative government. To mark the publication of the Conservative government's record on social policy from May 2015 to pre-COVID 2020. Policies, Spending and Outcomes. It's a volume edited by Vizard and by John Hills. The research is a product of a partnership between the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the LSE and colleagues at Manchester, Heriot-Watt and the Institute of Education. And it was funded by a generous grant from the Nuffield Foundation, for whom we are very grateful for the support. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers for you today, but before I ask them to speak, I have to say there is one distressing omission from the list, and that is Professor Sir John Hills. As most of you will know, John died tragically and prematurely just before Christmas. This isn't the place for a full-scale tribute to John. There will be a later events and times for that. However, he did play a leading role in this research, and I would just like us to mark his contribution by a minute's pause. It's a pause for reflection on John, his achievements in the policy and academic world, and even more importantly, his fundamental decency and humanity. So could we just pause for 1 minute, please? And Bert, could you put up the slide? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now, John would have wanted us to get on with the event, so let's do so. A few words about the event itself and its running order. The title is What Needs Fixing to Build Back Better? Fault Lines in the British Welfare State on the Eve of the Pandemic. Fairly self-explanatory. We'll be hearing more about that shortly. But we will begin with an introduction from Baroness Minouche Shafik. She is, of course, the director of the LSE, but that's simply the latest in a long line of distinguished positions, including Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and Permanent Secretary of the late lamented Department for International Development. Then we shall hear from Polly Vizard and Tania Burchardt about the project itself. Polly is the Associate Director and Associate Professorial Fellow of CASE, and she co-led the project with John Hills. Tania Burchardt is Associate Director of CASE and is an Associate Professor in Social Policy, and she is a co-investigator on the programme. We will then hear from three respondents: Lord David Willetts, Chairman of the Resolution Foundation. He has again an enormously distinguished record working on social policy in government and elsewhere, and has a variety of roles, including Minister for Universities and Science from 2010 to 2014. Our next respondent is Moira Wallace. She is a visiting professor at CASE. She has been Provost of Oriel College, Oxford, Permanent Secretary of the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and, of particular interest to us at CASE, the Director of the Social Exclusion Unit from 1997 to 2001. And our third respondent is Carl Emmerson. He is Deputy Director of the IFS and a member of the Social Security Advisory Committee and an advisory panel for the Office of Budget Responsibility. There's much more about them, I think, in the paperwork you've been sent. Then there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, could you put it into the Q&A? Karis Cooper and Polina Obolenskaya from CASE will be monitoring the questions and will organize the replies from the relevant member of the research team or from the panel if you wish to ask them a question. You can also vote for any question that you particularly would like to see asked by clicking on the thumbs up icon. There is no chat, but if you wish to tweet about the event, please do so using the hashtag #FixingInequalities. That hashtag will be up on in the Q&A. The event is being recorded and will be online after the event has finished. We don't think we're going to be able to reply to all the questions, fully to the questions. We don't have very long for the Q&A, I'm afraid, but we will attempt to provide a short note about some of the issues raised in the Q&A alongside the video when it's posted. Well, that's all I have to say at the moment. I should say that after the Q&A, Francis Cairncross will offer a few words. Francis worked for The Economist and has a very distinguished record, again, working as an economist, as former head of Oxford College as well. And she's a current member of the Council of Institute for Fiscal Studies. Then I will close with a few remarks myself at the end of the event. We will finish, hopefully, by 1:15 or so. So, without further ado, let's get on with the talks themselves. So, Minouche, could I ask you to speak to us?
Great. Thank you so much, Julian. And I wish John Hills was here to be with us, but it was wonderful that we could acknowledge him at the start. So this report comes at an incredibly opportune moment. Some of you will know that at the LSE, we've been doing a whole program of research, which we've put under the banner of Beveridge 2.0, of rethinking the welfare state for the 21st century. And of course, the pandemic has raised a whole new set of challenges to our thinking about that. The slogan, Build Back Better, is obviously the slogan of the day across the world. But of course, before you build, you have to know what foundations you're building on top of. And this report lays very clearly what the foundations are and where the fragilities are. And I just wanted to comment on 4 particular areas that I think are highly relevant to how we think about building back better. And they are our approach to austerity, inequality, work, and sustainable funding of public services. And I'll just say something very briefly about all of those because we will come back to those themes, I think, many times today. On austerity, I think the report shows very clearly the consequences of the attempt to have fiscal consolidation after the 2008 financial crisis. I think most economists would now say that the attempt at fiscal consolidation came too early, that we should have waited longer. I think that's true in the UK. I think that's certainly true in the US. There's a sense that the fiscal stimulus was inadequate for the recovery after the financial crisis in the US. And I think that's true for large parts of Europe. So it's not just a UK issue. I think that lesson is quite important for us to hold on to as we think about the recovery from COVID. UK GDP is now at, it's still a bit lower than it was at the end of World War II, but not by much, 100% of GDP. And we all know there are three ways to get out of debt. You have austerity, you grow, or you inflate it away. And I think the lesson from what happened in 2008 is that we got the balance wrong there. And I hope we hold on to that in terms of thinking about relying a bit more on growth and taking advantage of these unprecedentedly low interest rates to lay the foundations for a different approach to recovering from debt and building a new kind of what I call a social contract. I think that points toward investing a lot more in things like early years, in skills, which are highlighted in the report, to lay the foundation for future growth and social mobility, and also using it as a chance to kind of rethink our pre-distribution policies to create the conditions for a different kind of social contract and growth going forward. That's on austerity. Let me say something quickly about inequality. We all know that wealth inequality has grown massively in the recent period. But after the 2008 financial crisis, income inequality did not get worse because the top tier suffered, the top bit of the income distribution suffered a bit more. I think I have not seen good numbers post-COVID because we're still in the thick of it, but I am more than willing to bet that we will see that inequality will have got worse during COVID, mainly because a lot of high income people kept their jobs and didn't, had nowhere to spend it, and a lot of low-income people had either lost their jobs or were on furlough and received only 80% of their normal income. But what the report shows is that whatever we think about inequality, the minimum that we provided people was not enough, be it for children, for the elderly, the squeezing of benefits, that essentially the safety net got lowered during that period, during the period up until pre-COVID. Now, COVID, of course, has changed the terms of that radically, but I think we need a new debate about what the minimum that people should expect is. I'm particularly fond of a quote from Beatrice Webb, which comes from her dissent in the 1909 Royal Commission on the Poor Laws, where she said that in the UK, we needed to secure a national minimum of civilized life, open to all alike of both sexes and all classes, by which we mean sufficient nourishment and training when young, a living wage when able-bodied, treatment when sick, and a modest but secure livelihood when disabled or aged. I suspect Beatrice would judge us pretty harshly over 100 years later as to whether we've been able to deliver that sort of minimum. So I think a debate on the minimum is essential. Third point is on work. The report talks about how the period post-financial crisis to 2015 was characterized by high employment, but very low wages, and this rise in precarious and flexible working. I think the balance between flexibility in our labor market and security has tilted too far in the direction of flexibility. And the fact that huge numbers of these precarious workers have no benefits is something that that COVID has revealed as being hugely problematic, be it sick leave or other benefits. I think the Supreme Court's decision last week around Uber drivers is actually quite a pivotal moment in terms of thinking about this growing proportion of the labor force who is on flexible terms in terms of what their entitlements to security and social insurance should be. Having said that, while I think we do need to think about mandating security to all workers, regardless of the nature of their employment contract, I do think we have to think very hard going forward about flexibility. We know that many jobs will disappear post-COVID. And at the moment, people are being held in place through the furlough program. I would argue that the furlough program should have been made portable, for example, and so that people could take their furlough wage subsidy to move to the jobs of the future, rather than trapping them into the jobs of the past. Moreover, more investment in things like active labor market policies, which the report also talks about, will be essential in the period going forward to help all those people whose jobs will disappear in areas like retail and enable them to move to the jobs of the future. Finally, on sustainable funding of public services, I think we've seen the consequences of probably premature austerity on public services, and the report documents that very clearly. I think going forward, there will be huge pressure for more spending, particularly around healthcare, but also around things like social care. And there's already a lively debate, a lot of it happening at LSE, about where the money's going to come from. Carbon taxes, wealth taxes, taxing pensions differently, taxing capital gains. And I think we need to think very hard also about the balance of taxation between capital versus labor, and whether we've got that. I think we've got that wrong, and whether we could revisit that. And that's all well and good, but I also think we cannot lose sight of cost control. I think the UK does have room to raise taxes a bit, but we also need to be thinking about how to control costs, particularly around health and care. And there, I think, again, the pandemic has opened up all sorts of new possibilities. You know, telemedicine, which was not taking, not going great guns before COVID, has now become commonplace, and lots of people have got used to seeing their doctor online, or seeing getting medical advice online, and getting medical services online. Digital apps for monitoring vital signs are now very, very possible. And so I think we also need to have a debate about what we have learned that will help us contain costs, alongside thinking about how we will raise taxes to achieve sustainable funding of public services. Finally, all I would say is I think we are at a critical juncture, and this report comes at a critical time. The pandemic has gone on far too long for us to go back to anything. We have to move forward in a new and different way. And I think this report will help shape our thinking on how to move forward, given where the fault lines were, given the lessons from the last crisis. And I'm really looking forward to the debate today and to seeing how some of the ideas in it will shape how we build forward better.
Thank you very much indeed, Minouche. Some stimulating ideas there. I'm interested in the idea of the flexibility of the furlough. I think that would have been an interesting idea to have put forward still. We're now moving to Polly Vizard, who is going to tell us about the research itself.
Thank you. Can you see my screen and hear me, Julian?
Yes.
Good.
For both.
Thank you very much. So the report that we're publishing today examines the social policy record of the Conservative governments that were in power between May 2015 and pre-COVID early 2020. As you've been hearing, it looks at policy developments, public spending trends, and evidence on outcomes over that period. We examined developments across 10 social policy areas with contributions by a large research team whose names are on the screen now, and many of whom are available to respond to questions on particular social policy areas today. By way of background, it's important to say that the research builds on similar assessments we've made of the social policy record of previous governments, including the coalition government between 2010 and 2015, and the Labour governments that were in power between 1997 and 2010, and also similar analysis looking at previous periods by John Hills and colleagues going back way before that. It's also important to contextualise the findings in the report, and we've heard something of that already. So the second decade of the 21st century was distinctly a cold context for social policy making in general. The decade will be remembered as being sandwiched between two major national and global crises, the financial crisis of 2007-8 and the subsequent downturn, and then COVID at the end. The low GDP productivity, wage and living standards growth that characterised the period after the 2007-8 crisis continued to loom large in the period we've been looking at after the May 2015 general election, as well as the broader context of fiscal consolidation, fiscal deficit and debt that we've heard about in the introduction. So although the analysis in the report focuses on the period between May 2015 and early 2020 and stops just before COVID-19 and the economic and social shocks that it's triggered, the programme findings do provide a detailed evidence base on social policies and social inequalities on the eve of the pandemic. And that's what we're focusing on in our presentations today. Looking across the 10 social policy areas, we identify 5 cross-cutting concerns on the weaknesses and limitations of the welfare state and public services on the eve of the pandemic. And that's what I'm going to briefly summarise for you now. We also argue that the policy lessons from the pre-pandemic period should not be overlooked because of the enormity of the pandemic itself. And Tania will be following up by summarising what we see as the key cross-cutting policy insights and lessons from the period. So our first major concern is that while employment had reached a sustained high level and participation in higher education was also historically high on the eve of the pandemic, the evidence from our social security, employment, early childhood and homelessness papers provides strong evidence that the protective capacity of the welfare state have been eroded in multiple ways. Our social security paper argues that the role of the welfare state changed profoundly during the second decade of the 21st century, and that the capacity of the social safety net to protect working families, working age adults and families with children from poverty was substantially weakened. Now, some of the relevant changes here were brought about by the coalition during the first 5 years of the 2010s, but the programme findings suggest that these changes were taken further and intensified after May 2015. So, for example, while pensioner income continued to be protected through the triple lock as it had been under the coalition, the real value of the minimum income guarantee for non-pensioner groups was eroded, including through the effects of the benefits and tax credit freeze. Support from housing support from housing benefit was also further restricted. And new social protection gaps opened up, notably the introduction of a 2-child limit, which intensified the effects of the earlier benefit cap and further decoupled social support from need. Other social protection gaps identified across the programme include social protection gaps relating to gig economy and self-employed workers, and also social protection gaps relating to restrictions on the entitlements of some migrant groups. Hardship also resulted from benefit deductions associated, for example, with the system of advances under universal credit, but also from sanctioning and other deductions of debt and arrears. Overall spending on social security and tax credits was cut in real terms between 2014-15 and 2019-20. And this chart from the social security paper shows that the declines were very much concentrated on child-related expenditure. So the chart shows the cumulative change in social security and tax spending during the course of the second decade of the 21st century. And it shows this separately for pensioner-related spending related to working age adults and children. So we see that the purple bars show that pensioner-related spending was broadly maintained. These grey bars show that spending on working age adults, change in spending in working age adults remained positive, but the black and white stripy bars at the bottom show the cumulative cuts to child-related spending. So, for example, spending on child tax credits and child benefit. So the upshot was that on the eve of the pandemic, not only did we lack contributory social security, social insurance arrangements that might have provided better protection of income replacement levels and related to those more firmly to wages in the event of unemployment, but also the system that we did have the minimum social safety net system had been substantially eroded and weakened compared to the position going into previous recessions and downturns. Our second major concern is that while the fiscal deficit was reduced, resource, workforce and capacity pressures built up across multiple public services simultaneously, resulting in a failure to meet current needs, compromising quality and eroding the resilience of public services to shocks. So our education paper shows that current spending on schools in England remained broadly stable, but that pupil numbers grew, so per pupil funding fell and post-16 funding declined. As a result, schools came under increasing strain with a rise in pupil-teacher ratios and particular delays and gaps in special educational needs provision. Our physical safety and security paper reports that total expenditure on police services, prisons and law courts flatlined during this period following a previous period of significant decline in spending, but that despite this, in 2018-19, spending per prisoner was still below its 2010-11 levels, and the period was associated with a decline in standards of safety, security, health, hygiene, order and basic decency within prisons. The paper also identifies a particular shortage of places in refuges for women and children fleeing domestic abuse on the eve of the pandemic. Our adult social care paper identifies that while spending growth was positive during this period following a previous period of cuts, chronic under-resourcing continued, resulting in a very wide gulf between need and the capacity to supply coordinated, comprehensive and high-quality care. Our health paper identifies that the period was characterised by repeated warnings around resource limitations, workforce shortages, increasing waiting within the system, and winter pressures. Ambitions for a major drive on preventative health and health inequalities and public health were also not delivered. So in 2012, as part of the coalition's health reforms, public health functions were devolved to local government, and there was a promise of a major drive in those areas that didn't materialise. Health spending was higher, grew more rapidly than under the coalition, and there was a particular uplift in July 2018 at the time of the 70th anniversary of the NHS, but nevertheless, looking at average growth rates over the second decade of 21st century as a whole, they were very low, historically speaking, and failed to keep up with growth in common indicators of need and demand. This chart shows bed pressures in general and acute wards in English hospitals over the period. We see that there was some quarterly variation in bed availability, but overall bed availability goes down over the period, and the black line shows the percentage of bed occupancy, and that there was a particular peak in the winter of 2017-18 at 93% in Q4 of that period, winter 2017-18. And it's worth just remembering what winter pressures were like at that time. For example, in January 2018, there was a very widespread cancellation or postponement of non-emergency surgery. We were very worried about delayed discharges at that time. And also looking at the ONS excess death series, which we're much more familiar with now, looking for monitoring all-cause mortality during COVID. Deaths were running very high, excess deaths over that period. 20,000 excess deaths recorded in the provisional death registration data between December and March. So perhaps an early warning, so particularly impacting on older people over 85, and an early warning of how infectious disease can interact with longer survival and conditions. Also worth noting that another period of high pressure on bed occupancy was in late 2019 on the eve of COVID-19. So we have a second peak in Q3 of 2019-20. That, of course, preceded the large movement of older people from the hospital sector to the care home sector. Our third area of concern is that the welfare state and public services have been adapting to the rising and different needs and circumstances of the 21st century, but not fully. So adaptation deficits and challenges identified across the programme relate to the changing labour market and technological change and the rise of non-standard work, to changing family structures and single parent families, social recognition and rising prevalence of poor mental health and special educational needs, and demographic change and population ageing. The population ageing is a major international challenge. It's a challenge in Britain too, and it has been associated with new forms of inequalities, including through the work of the Resolution Foundation, new forms of intergenerational inequalities, particularly impacting on young adults. Now, the adverse circumstances of young adults in the decade is something that's identified through the programme. At the same time, we also emphasise the ways in which inequalities accrue over lifetimes and the extent of inequalities within the older population itself. So to illustrate this, this is a chart from the adult social care paper, which shows that there were substantial inequalities in the support that over 65s receive in meeting their basic needs by neighbourhood deprivation level. So here we see that the proportion reporting that they need a basic, they need support with basic activities of living, such as getting washed, getting dressed, going to the toilet, going shopping, and so forth. We have a much higher proportion reporting needing of over 65s reporting needing support of that type in the most deprived neighbourhoods compared to the least deprived neighbourhoods. And also that if you do have a need of that kind, then you're much more likely to report need unmet need for care if you live in a more deprived neighbourhood. This second chart shows that although there was some more policy recognition of the role of adult informal carers over this period, the intensity of care provided by adult informal carers for family or friends with a disability or health condition was increasing. So this is unpaid informal care, for example, a husband providing care for a wife with Alzheimer's or dementia, or providing support for an elderly, frail parent. And we see that the proportion of adults reporting providing care for more than 35 hours a week was increasing during this period. So very intense forms of unpaid informal support. Our fourth area of concern is that although more emphasis was given to skills after 2016, as the country's post-Brexit requirements and needs for regional rebalancing became more recognised, social investment and investment in people, human capital approaches continue to be given insufficient priority. It's worth noting that public expenditure on further education and adult learning and skills fared particularly badly in terms of public expenditure cuts during the second decade of the 21st century. And this chart here shows that while a new apprenticeship levy was introduced during the period, new apprenticeship starts for the under-19s were on a downward trajectory even before COVID. So these black segments do so show some increasing opportunities for higher level apprenticeships for this age group over the period, which is to be welcomed as a pathway into higher productivity and higher paid work. But these declining purple segments show the loss of intermediate, lower level apprenticeships. And this reinforces a concern expressed by the Social Mobility Commission in relation to a lack of apprenticeships for disadvantaged groups and more generally a disproportionate lack of training, upskilling and retraining opportunities for those with lower level educational qualifications. Our fifth area of concern is that there was mounting evidence of a slowdown in social progress and a widening of inequalities across multiple, multidimensional areas of life on the eve of the pandemic. So our analysis of outcomes identifies 8 particular areas of concern. First relates to child poverty, and the chart you can see here shows the upward trend in child poverty for kids living in families with 3 or more children. We also identify across the programme concerns around rising child poverty for with families with very young children, high levels of child poverty for children living in single parent families, and rising levels of child poverty for some children from ethnic minority groups, particularly Black, Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups. Second area of concern is rising in-work poverty. So even where families are in work, rising levels of poverty. So we do identify positive developments over minimum wages through this period, and also rising participation levels for some groups. But nevertheless, some of those groups were also recording higher levels of in-work poverty. We're particularly concerned about in-work poverty for workers with a disabled person in their household, amongst single workers who are single parents, and from some ethnic minority groups, particularly the Black group. Homelessness was rising, and this chart shows the rise in England. So homelessness was rising in England over the period to 2017, shown in the chart. In 2017, our homelessness paper identifies some improvement associated, we think, with the rough sleepers strategy and new duties to reduce homelessness, which are identified as a positive development within the programme. More generally, a loss of momentum in reducing educational gaps by free school meal status. Early childhood inequalities, concerns about free school meal status and early developmental outcomes, also some childhood health inequalities, including a stall in improvement, or an overall stall in improvements in infant mortality and inequalities relating to low birth weight of babies, and also a widening of obesity inequalities shown here for reception age children. Mortality inequalities and health inequalities, very big finding during this period. We show here the widening female life expectancies. In general, there was a stall in progress in life expectancy in the second decade of the 21st century. But for the most deprived people, for females in the most deprived neighbourhoods, there was a decline, and this has resulted in a widening of female life expectancy gaps. Unmet need for care, I've already discussed. Eighth areas of concern relates to physical security and safety outcomes, rising knife crime, rising homicide rates in the run-up to the pandemic, particular high risks for young 16 to 24-year-old Black young people when it comes to homicide, and also rising domestic homicide. There was a 5-year high in the figures that were published and available for March 2019. So overall, we conclude that with key indicators, progress against key indicators slowing down, stalling or going into reversal, there's strong evidence of a break in social progress prior to the outbreak of the public health emergency in around early 2020. So I'm now going to hand over to Tania, who's going to talk about the insights and lessons from the pre-pandemic period.
Thank you, Polly. As you know, we're not a think tank, and our remit is not to make specific policy recommendations. But what we can do is to draw out from the analysis of policies, spending and outcomes that you've just outlined, some lessons for what works and what doesn't work, and what that implies if we're to kickstart social progress after a period largely characterised by stalling and reversals. The chapters in the overview report and the underlying papers detail some of the key issues in each policy area. But here I want to concentrate on 5 cross-cutting challenges. The first challenge is one that Minouche has already referred to create a sustainable funding model as a foundation for a welfare state and public services that are fit for purpose for the 2020s. We face a challenge of deficit reduction and rebuilding economic growth, similar in some ways to the early 2010s. But in many ways, the situation now is worse because it comes on the back of a decade of austerity, and we're starting with a very high baseline of social inequalities. The welfare state and public services therefore face an uphill task, despite the challenge of needing to get control of the overall public spending deficit. It's crucial that we don't make the same mistakes, as Minouche has already outlined, in particular, relying on an excessive public spending cuts as the way out of this difficulty. What we've learned through the analysis in this programme, and others have also identified, is that this form of social disinvestment not only carries a heavy price for those directly affected, but is also inefficient. Turning public spending taps off and on creates bigger costs downstream. Smoothing the flow of public spending will allow for better planning of services and better outcomes for people using those services. So what's to be done? Well, in the short run, although we hear rather less about them, there are industries and sections of the economy that have done well during the pandemic. Tech companies, for example. Thank you, Zoom, for making this webinar possible. That's terrific. And the 3,000% increase in profits reported by Zoom is a windfall gain that would not have been expected were it not for the pandemic. There are entertainment streaming services that have done very well. There are supermarkets, there are home exercise equipment manufacturers, a whole range of different sections of the economy that have had windfall gains. And redistributing some of those gains to those sectors that have been particularly hard hit would seem to be one possible way forward. Similarly, there are groups of individuals, especially professionals, including academics, who, as Minouche mentioned, have retained their incomes by and large, but seen their expenditures plummet during this period. A solidarity tax would seem an appropriate form. In the longer term, modernising the taxation system, including capturing the digital economy, green taxes, and a taxation of wealth seem a high priority. Of course, some tax proposals need international cooperation, but again, this seems the moment to try to negotiate on some of those, given that all economies have suffered and all countries will be looking at the fiscal situation. Other reforms could include reforming property and land taxes, raising income tax, exploring hypothecation for health and social care, or indeed new social insurance, now that we have rediscovered that protecting living standards against shocks is an important function of the welfare state. The evidence on social attitudes produced as part of this programme of research suggests that there may be more commonality in attitudes towards inequality and the welfare state than we often assume. And international experts at our roundtable on theories of welfare argued that options that had seemed non-viable politically before the pandemic may no longer be so. Now is not the time for timidity. It's a critical juncture with the potential to be a new beverage moment, but also a dangerous juncture. There's the possibility to create a new social contract or to allow divisions within society to become permanent. That leads me to the second challenge that we identify, which is the importance of strengthening accountability for improving social outcomes and reducing social inequalities. Statutory duties and outcome targets can strengthen national and local accountability mechanisms. For example, the Welfare and Work Act in 2016 repealed child poverty targets in England, whilst in 2017, the Child Poverty Act in Scotland introduced targets. Subsequently, it's clear that the Westminster government took its eye off the ball, to use an apt footballing metaphor, when it comes to child poverty. The Scottish government did not. In fact, the targets were followed with the delivery plan, and that in turn has produced changes in policy, such as the £10 per week Scottish child payment. In other areas, we've also seen a weakening of accountability in England. For example, academisation of schools has weakened the accountability of schools for those outcomes. Our analysis as part of the programme of the repeated failure to implement the recommendations of the Social Mobility Commission points to the lack of an accountability mechanism as a serious weakness there. Conversely, there have been some new duties introduced, for example, in relation to health inequalities, services for unpaid carers, and homelessness. Mostly these have been targeted duties for local authorities, although also for NHS England and some other organisations. But they've been undermined by the lack of local authority capacity as the result of the cumulative erosion of their resources through a decade of cuts. There's also a lack of infrastructure to support individuals and organisations to pursue claims, for example, as a result of the emasculation of welfare rights advice services and the removal of legal aid from most cases. So what can be done? An easy win would be the adoption of the Scottish child poverty targets for the rest of the UK, suitably adapted. The funding streams associated with new duties for local authorities need to be reviewed, and there needs to be monitoring of the effectiveness of these duties, including accessible routes of appeal by both organisations and individuals, and proactive mechanisms for sharing good practice across authorities. The third challenge is to develop multidimensional strategies and interventions that join up different social policy areas and extend across multiple life domains. The rigidity of policy and service delivery silos is a long recognised problem. And a number of people on the panel today and in the audience have been involved in cross-departmental policy making, carrying out analysis that starts from a person rather than from a problem, and creating person-centred services rather than expecting users to organise themselves around the convenience of the service. So we do know that it's possible, and we do know what works. Spectrum, we've also seen what fails. Endless reviews, for example. Why was it that the work of the Race Disparity Unit, who issued as a result of the analysis of inequalities in public services by race and ethnicity that they'd identified, an explain or change challenge to government departments, why is it that that in fact has been superseded by another review, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Inequalities? We also know that asking services to innovate and to find new ways to work together when they're already at or beyond their capacity for delivering their minimum statutory requirements is not going to work. So we need to build on some examples of emerging good practice to take forward this important challenge. The serious violence strategy introduced by Theresa May was a multi-agency public health approach to preventing interpersonal violence. But that needs national implementation, and it needs corresponding capacity in all of those agencies to make it happen. There are some very promising initiatives in devolved authorities, for example, in Greater Manchester with integrated health and social care, and a number of other local examples of effective integration, including through the use of pooled budgets. More broadly, the social determinants approach to health is now widely accepted, but the social determinants approach to the need for personal care is in its infancy. The fourth challenge is giving first priority to the needs of the most disadvantaged as part of a comprehensive public action to reduce social inequalities. Of course, the specific identity of the most disadvantaged varies across policy areas. But as Polly showed, the position of some of the most disadvantaged social groups deteriorated during the second decade of the 21st century. And often policies have failed to address the needs of the most disadvantaged. And in some cases, policies have actively exacerbated this disadvantage, such as the intentional creation of shortfalls and holes in the basic income safety net. Layered on top of this, there has now been a massive further redistribution from the worst off to the better off during the pandemic, as Minouche also referred to. So we suggest that there should be a new cross-cutting prioritisation rule for the most disadvantaged. This means not just a toothless equality impact assessment, but a recognition that who the worst off is varies across policies and across different aspects of life. It might be children in receipt of free school meals. It might be Afro-Caribbean men with very low rates of social mobility, as the social mobility paper indicates. It might be low birth weight babies that Polly already referred to. It might be women over 80 and their unmet needs for social care. In each and every case, it's their interest that needs specific attention within an overall policy framework. This suggestion should not be confused with a retreat into means testing, targeting, and selectivity. Instead, it requires testing policy proposals against their combined impact on the worst off and ensuring that their needs are considered first and foremost. It means universal services with additional targets and provision for the most disadvantaged to focus the attention of service providers and reduce those gaps. Furthermore, we could be more ambitious in addressing the pre-distribution of income and wealth, examining the rules of the game that generate economic inequalities in the first place, as proposed by Tony Atkinson and Joseph Stiglitz, for example. Addressing those mechanisms, both in the law and in the market, in terms of wage and housing policies, and through intergenerational transfers. Our final challenge is the challenge of embedding a new values-based approach to social policy, based on dignity and respect, on recognition, and turning the applause for key workers that we've all participated in into a commitment to take social value seriously. This approach is, I think, gaining momentum, as, for example, in the enshrining of human dignity as a guiding principle of Scottish social security, and the translation of principles of dignity and respect into fundamental standards and person-centred care in the NHS. This means addressing the long-standing under-recognition of both paid and unpaid providers of care, as well as guaranteeing minimum standards of adequacy of care, as well as minimum standards of adequacy of social security. It also means ensuring that these values are woven into the fabric of public service design, delivery, and monitoring. We're living through an unprecedented disruption to social and economic life. The crisis has exposed both some of the best and some of the worst pre-existing features of British society, public services, and the welfare state. There's a window of opportunity for bold thinking and for radical change. And we hope that the analysis in our report and the challenges that we set out can help to inform this change. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Polly and Tania. So without further ado, David, could we ask make your contribution?
Thank you very much indeed, Julian, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. I would like to begin by very much saying how much I regret the loss of John Hills, who I did know for 40 years. I learned a lot over the years from John, and I've learned a lot over the years from Case, and I'm still learning, and it was a fantastic presentation that we just had. Because it was pretty challenging and tough stuff, I hope I can just briefly draw attention to three things that I think have gone a little bit better than the prevailing view, and then turn to the future. And if I look back over the last 10 years, the three that I would particularly draw attention to are first, the performance of the labour market. Now, of course, there is an issue of low pay, and at Resolution, we're very aware of it. But the employment record of the UK economy in the past 10 years has been excellent. And if anything, it has been associated with a reduction in income and earnings inequality. And we, of course, have had, in the period covered by this report, the arrival of the national living wage. So there are still massive challenges, including poverty amongst working families. But compared with some previous decades, we might regard the performance of the labour market as a relative success. Secondly, policy can work. And although we've just heard from Tania some really important challenges about policy making, one conspicuous example is the success of auto-enrolment in pensions, a real cross-party consensus with all three main parties involved at different stages in government, and most recently tested again during the COVID virus. I think the gossip is that as the virus began, there was quite a lively policy debate about what should happen for exchequer contributions into the auto-enrolled pensions, for example, of people who are furloughed. Those have all been maintained. So this should give us all hope that you can formulate policy well and secure cross-party consensus for it. And thirdly, I hope I'm just allowed to point out that the analysis of higher education participation does show that that has increased over this period. And although there is a gap, a shocking gap still between participation from high income groups and low income groups, that gap has also narrowed a bit. So although it's cloudy, there are also some rays of sunshine. And now let me now turn to what we should do for the future, how we build back better. And I would like to identify 4 particular areas of policy that I think we should focus on. The first, obviously, is the social care challenge, and the crisis of the past year has thrown once again into sharp relief our failures there. And Tania is right, we've had quite a lot of reviews of social care. It's one area, a classic example where we don't need another review, we just need to get on with it. And I think the Andrew Dilnot framework is the right framework where you do expect more affluent pensioner households to contribute to the costs of social care, but with a cap on the total amount that they pay and a floor below which their assets do not fall. And I regard tackling social care as an emblem of a wider issue about how we fund public services in the future. Because one of the biggest single changes in the structure of the British economy over the last 30, 40 years has been the rise in the value of assets relative to GDP, up from 3 times GDP to 7 times GDP. And even whilst this has been happening, there's been no increase in the proportion of GDP taken in capital taxes. That's why it's right to expect older people who do have assets to make a contribution to their social care costs, even if that contribution is deferred and taken from their estate after death. But I also think that it means as we start looking at the inevitable fiscal measures that are going to be needed, absolutely no rush to do it. I agreed with Minouche's wise. Down the track, it will be necessary. I think we have to look at capital taxation. I don't believe there is a single great monolithic wealth tax that will do, but there are various ways in which our taxes on capital can be improved. And an obvious place to start is council tax, which is our main capital tax, if you look at OECD and ONS definitions, but a shockingly regressive one. That's the first area. The second area is younger people who have had a raw deal, and the report today drawing a lot on the work we've done at Resolution in our intergenerational centre shows how tough things have been for younger people. And one of the figures that brings this out vividly is that The benefit incomes to pensioners have increased by £200 on top of inflation, but for families have fallen by £200 below inflation. Now, of course, in an ideal world, everything goes up, but when there are policy trade-offs, at the moment, they have systematically been favouring older people over younger people, and we have to do more to help them. I think here there is actually a very interesting demographic opportunity. The number of births hit a low point in the year 2001 of 670,000 live births, and then grew steadily during the first decade of this century to a high point of 810,000 births in 2012. In other words, we are going to see a gradual increase over the coming decade of the number of people entering their 20s. That's an opportunity and a challenge for the labour market and for the education system, which we should seize. And the evidence from the virus, again, there's one cautiously encouraging bit of evidence that it looks as if anything, it's participation in education, notably higher education, that has taken some of the strain as these young people have reached the ages of 18, 19, 20, rather than it being showing up in big increases in the number who are need. What does that mean for policy? It means, of course, continuing to investment in vocational training. The figures on apprenticeships that we saw a moment ago are very challenging, but of course, apprenticeships require having a prior employment. And we really need to focus as well on traineeships that do not require prior employment in order to access vocational training. We should invest more in level 4 and 5 qualifications, including delivered at universities. We should help people not just with upskilling, and the very welcome announcement for the government last autumn was mainly about upskilling. We should also look at reskilling, people moving horizontally to a different set of skills. And higher education will not be a shrinking sector, it will be a growing sector, and we should plan for that growth. Thirdly, mobility. And mobility means both geographical, social, labour market mobility. And it does look as if one of the problems Britain has got at the moment is declines in mobility on every measure. And it looks as if the signals in the labour market aren't working. In the areas where wages are higher, private rents are also significantly higher, so the post-housing cost income of workers in those areas are no higher, a weaker signal about the jobs and places to move to. In an area where capital has increased in value so much, inheritance matters more, which is a real challenge. So anything that can help younger people become more mobile, maintenance support, if they're living away from home, becomes very important. Also signaling where the new jobs are. It is so frustrating that today in the labour market, twice as many young people badly hit by the COVID crisis in those personal contact sectors like retail, twice as many people are applying for jobs in retail as in social care, when there are actually twice as many vacancies in social care than in retail. That's a failure of the functioning of a flexible labour market, signalling where the opportunities are. And then fourth, and finally on my list for Build Back Better is, of course, the real economy, which underpins all this. And this COVID virus crisis has some very unusual features. Usually during a recession, the financial health of companies and the household sector deteriorates. However unevenly distributed, overall, this one has seen a very different reaction. We published a report at Resolution Foundation just the other week, showing that whereas in previous recessions, companies' cash reserves have on average fallen by £40 billion, during this one, they are up by £118 billion. Now, a lot of that is soft loans, including soft loans from banks guaranteed by government, things like that. But nevertheless, it does mean that there is a potential there for business investment. And of course, similarly, the increase in improvement in household balance sheets concentrated amongst older people and more affluent people, probably over 100 billion. This is an opportunity for future investment, to promote an opportunity to promote business investment, an opportunity to invest in new technologies, an opportunity for government also to invest in social care and in the shared public and private investment in green jobs. And that is the single most important way in which we could indeed build back better. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, David. I might point out incidentally that many people know that you mentioned also enrolment of pensions. Of course, John Hills was very much involved in the Pension Commission that
Indeed.
actually introduced that.
Indeed.
Thank you. Moira, over to you.
Thank you very much. So thank you for involving me in this really interesting seminar. And I'd like to start by congratulating everyone on the research team for their excellent work, comprehensive, insightful, and in that wonderful tradition that John Hills established of bringing to visibility how social policies actually operate on the ground and quantifying their impact. And I'm sure John would be very proud of the work that's being produced. I want to situate my remarks sort of in this strange context we're in at the moment, where we're looking at the findings of research that was commissioned before the pandemic began and tells the story of the welfare state as it stood before the crisis. But we're thinking about it at a time when we've learned even more about the welfare state over the last 12 months. And I know the team worried that by the time this research came out, people would not have any headspace to listen to its findings. But actually, I think what we've heard is extremely timely. And it tells us a lot about why we found the pandemic so difficult in the UK, about what we're going to have to do to recover from it. So it's definitely not overtaken. I think the greater risk is that this report is a bit overwhelming because it does illustrate so many challenges across so many services. But I'm an optimist, and I think I've been asked to contribute because I've got a policy background, especially in joined up policy in social policy areas. So I was asked to suggest how a government might respond to what we've heard today. And I thought I would try and suggest some good places to start. And I'm just going to suggest 3. So I'm underperforming compared with David. But I also thought I'd try and just build on the principles that Tania suggested in her remarks. So I've got 3 policy suggestions, each of which I think would be good stepping stones as we go forward. First relates to poverty, the second to education, and the third relates to health. And all my suggestions are, to the best of my ability, evidence-based. I think they'd be cost-effective, and I think they'd be mutually reinforcing. So my first suggestion relates to poverty, and it is the radical suggestion that the benefit system should stop causing food poverty. I've shamelessly stolen this idea from Marcus Rashford. But I think to be really serious about this, the findings of the report we've just read highlight very clearly some serious failings in support for children through the benefit system, and that there are a lot of families that are falling a long way below a reasonable poverty line because of the impact of benefit levels themselves, the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, the 5-week wait, housing and council tax changes. It's even worse for families that are affected by the no recourse to public funds rules. And so there are some families that just don't have enough money to live on. And all the evidence, some of it from colleagues on this team, tells us that growing up with inadequate or unhealthy diets or in an atmosphere of worry and financial stress has a really negative impact on children's education and health. And we know that these impacts don't pass with adulthood, that they will still be operating and they will still be costing money decades later. So we were in a bad situation before the pandemic. The findings of this report show that these effects were visible not just in food poverty, but in educational gaps on arrival at primary school and in secondary school. And a lot more families are going to be depending on benefits, so this will get worse. The good news is that the government has implicitly recognised that benefit levels were inadequate. That's why there's been a £20 uplift, and some of the other rules have been softened. But these temporary provisions need to be made permanent, and the government needs to change the rules that are causing the most hardship. Again, we're talking the 5-week waiting period, no recourse to public funds rules, the 2-child limit, the benefit cap. Because if these decisions are not fixed, they will do untold damage to millions of children. These are the children who are our future. child poverty, I don't really know why one needs to say this, but it's not a good investment. It's a form of short-term thinking, and we should return to viewing it as a real social evil, trying to eradicate it. Fixing this would pick up many of the themes that Tania just shared with us. It would deal with the cost of social disinvestment. It would be values-based. It would help the most disadvantaged, and it would connect action across different policy areas between the benefit system and education. And the best news of all is that decisions in this area are not hard to implement. They could be announced any day you like, and they could certainly be announced next week when there is a convenient budget on the way. So that's my first suggestion. My second suggestion also relates to children, but this time to education. We are expecting a catch-up plan for schools led by Sir Kevin Collins. And my suggestion is that it should have a very strong focus on the most disadvantaged children. Again, you might be thinking, surely that shouldn't need saying, and I'm sure that's what it's going to be about. And certainly in the media discussion of the impact of the pandemic on children, there's been no shortage of comment about how much harder homeschooling and online learning has been for the poorest families. But actually, the data we've just been hearing is a reminder that consistently over recent years, despite best intentions and a lot of rhetoric, it's the poor who keep losing out. And you can see that in emerging gaps in school results, in the rising school exclusions, and the shocking phenomenon of off-rolling, children just denied a school place at all. And that bias has not really changed in the pandemic. There's lots of evidence that it's the most vulnerable children that have had the least contact with schools, done the least online learning, and despite lots of good intentions to get laptops and Wi-Fi access to poor families, the quantity delivered has been less than the number needed. So hence my suggestion that whatever catch-up plan is developed is specifically focused on disadvantaged children. And to do that, I would specifically propose that there is local coordination to ensure that all disadvantaged children have a school place, have a plan to get back into learning, and all the support and infrastructure they need to support them. And by local coordination, I don't just mean suggesting it happens, I mean actually resourcing it, knowing who it is, and monitoring how well it happens. If we just leave it to schools that are already very stretched and are going to have an enormous task as children come back into the classroom, it will not work, and it will be the most vulnerable who lose. So again, to relate what I've just suggested to Tania's suggestions, this would be about organising services around the person, strengthening accountability, and giving priority to the needs of the most disadvantaged. My third suggestion is in the area of health, and this one is really simple. You could do it next week. My suggestion is, or you can certainly start next week, my suggestion is that we give the NHS the thank you gift that they deserve, which is a proper public health strategy. By a public health strategy, I don't mean a document or a reorganization, but I mean that the government does things that promote health and stops doing things that damage it. And my most simple suggestion could be implemented in next week's convenient budget, and it is that the government stops cutting alcohol duty and starts raising it again. So the government has frozen or cut alcohol duties in almost every budget since 2013 and has allowed the real price of alcohol to fall. And that may be welcomed by the industry, I understand that, but it's completely inappropriate from a public health point of view. It's got a shocking fiscal cost at a time when other sensitive services have been cut. It encourages consumption, we know that. And it adds to the burden of liver disease and obesity. Just to encourage you in this area, let me give you two facts on this, both from government documents. Mortality from liver disease in this country has increased fourfold in the last few decades, and the vast majority of those deaths are alcohol related. And alcohol is also an enormous contribution to obesity. You'll be glad my remarks are going to help you lose weight. The government's obesity strategy told us that 3.4 million adults consume an additional day's worth of calories each week through alcohol. So over a year, that's nearly 2 months more food just through alcohol. So it's not a trivial issue, fond as we all are of alcohol. and from a public health point of view, alcohol is too cheap. We could change that next budget. The Chancellor will either have to increase or hold steady or cut alcohol duties. So one way or another, we'll know how he views this. If we wanted to do even better, we could introduce a minimum unit price for alcohol. That has already happened in Scotland, and the early signs are very promising. So this suggestion has got it all. It helps you lose weight, raises money, improves public health, and reduces the burden on the NHS. So what more could you want? So just to sum up my three proposals, based on what we've heard from the research and what we know has been happening during the pandemic, I think it would be a really good idea to stop the benefit system causing food poverty, focus the educational catch-up plan on the most disadvantaged children, and make sure there is a named person or body locally coordinating that help actually reaches them. And thirdly, stop making alcohol cheaper, which would be good for the nation's health and raise some money in the process. And with that, I'm trying to give you a nice segue to the fiscal consolidation, which I'm sure we're now going to get some good ideas on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Moira. Yes, to add to your point about alcohol, of course, it would also have an impact on crime, on reductions in crime, and indeed reductions on attendance at accidents and emergency at NHS, which is an extraordinarily high proportion of which are alcohol related. Carl.
Thank you, Julian. So I'd like to start by stressing how much of a pleasure it's been to have been on the advisory board for this programme of work over the last 2 years or so. All incredibly important and all very, very interesting research. And I guess, like Moira, I want to stress that in some ways, in many ways, the research is now more timely, more relevant, more important than what would have been envisaged when it was first conceived. I think it's potentially, you might have thought, well, actually telling us about what was going on between 2015 and 2019, given that the last 12 months have been such a game changer in many ways, is it still relevant? I think very strongly the answer to that is yes. And I'm going to set out some of the context for what was going on both before this period, but also some evidence on what's happened since to highlight why it's still so important. And I'd just like to add that in doing so, I'm going to draw very heavily on some other Nuffield Foundation funded research at IFS, in particular, the work we do for our annual green budget, and also the ongoing Deaton review into inequalities. So the period from 2015 to 2019 saw big cuts to public spending in many areas, and these followed big cuts that have been made over the period starting in 2010, which the coalition government at the time had been doing in an attempt to reduce the deficit. That deficit, Minouche pointed out, we could have gone slower. We didn't really have a choice in the sense that we would have had to take action at some point. We couldn't have allowed such a large deficit to persist. Now, in making those cuts, I think it's quite likely that the first few cuts you make in many ways are going to be the easier ones to make. They were coming off a period where we'd seen big increases in spending, and it's clearly going to be easier to make cuts after a period of increases. So by the time we get to 2015 and you're trying to make cuts, I think it was inevitably going to be harder. The kind of very deliverable efficiency savings will already have been identified, will already have been done. And where there were perhaps programs that we might have thought of as nice to have, but quite low value, well, again, those programs are more likely to have already gone. So in many senses, I think this is an area where the first cut is not the deepest, and the cuts that came after 2015 were always going to be harder to do. Now, there's another reason why I think the cuts were difficult, and it's because in many cases, while in some cases it was unwinding some of the previous increases, that wasn't the case across the board. So for understandable reasons, there were protections to many areas of public spending. And that meant that actually some of the areas that were largely protected from cuts, or where the cuts were more modest, were areas where we'd seen pretty big increases before. And the flip side of that is it meant that some of the cuts that were being implemented were on areas which actually hadn't enjoyed big increases in spending. And I think the area where that's most obvious is if you look in the social security budget, where you can see it's very obvious that pensioner benefits in many dimensions were made more generous under Labour governments. They were then made more generous in many ways under coalition and then the subsequent Conservative government, in particular through the value of the triple lock. So that meant that the cuts to social security that were being made were focused on the working age population. And again, even within the working age population, you can see a very different balance. You can see that some of the cuts were made to benefits for families with children, but that's an area where actually benefits had on average been increased pretty substantially over the previous 10 years or so. So while it's the case that there have been cuts, that it's still also the case that on average, the working age benefit system for families with children, even today or even pre-COVID, was much more generous than it was back in 1997. Now, you might not think that's a valid comparison. The benefit system in 1997, price uprated, might not be what we'd aspire for, but it is the case that the system in many ways for those families with children is still more generous today. But if you take those who haven't got children, in particular, if you take those who are not in paid work, over 25, not disabled, no children, living alone, well, their basic rate of benefits hadn't been increased for many, many years prior to 2010. And therefore the cuts that followed, in particular, the move to less generous indexation, made those benefits fall in value even further. So there's a group there who were being hit by cuts to the benefits who hadn't experienced the increases that had previously been put in place. So if you take my kind of single childless individual aged over 25 who's out of work, well, actually the £20 a week increase in benefits that they've received this year through universal credit, that is a bigger real terms increase than all of the real terms increases for that rate of benefit over the previous 45 years put together. So a bigger increase in benefits in 1 year than what that group had seen for 45 years. And as Minouche pointed out, clearly that increase is put in place because the government accepted that with the pandemic, with the restrictions that were needed to keep the pandemic under control, the minimum level of income was simply too low. So there's a huge decision to be made in next week's budget about whether to allow that to disappear between March and April this year, or whether it should be continued either on a temporary or on a permanent basis. A very, very big decision to be made. And actually, it may also be the case that the level of benefits that we provide may have made it necessary for the government's furlough scheme and the scheme for the self-employed, both of which for those who are getting it are also very generous. It may mean that those schemes also had to be very, very big. And it may also make it harder for the government to get away from having those schemes in place, as it inevitably will want to do as restrictions ease. And finally, I want to touch on some of the inequalities that are highlighted in the report that's being launched today and talk a bit about how things have changed over the last year. And unfortunately, in most cases we've looked at, the big picture impression you get is that where there was an inequality that existed before the pandemic hit, the effect of COVID and the effect of the economic response to COVID has generally been to increase those inequalities. So it's been an inequality increasing year that we've been through. So if you take the labour market, well, it's clearly the low paid who are more likely to be working in a sector that's been shut down. They're less likely to have been able to work from home than those who are on average better paid. If you take the young, a group who've experienced very, very weak earnings growth over the years up to the pandemic, where they're 3 times more likely to have been furloughed than older workers, and they're 6 times been laid off already. If we look at mortality rates, as has been well documented, ethnic minorities are much more likely to die from COVID. And that's actually also the case even if you control for their age, where they live, and some of their background socioeconomic characteristics. And if you look more generally at age-adjusted death rates, we already know that prior to the pandemic hitting, people in poorer areas, their age-adjusted mortality rate was higher than those living in richer areas. Deaths from COVID follow a similar pattern. And actually, if anything, the gradient of deaths from COVID seem to be slightly more skewed towards poorer communities than deaths are more generally. If you look at mental health, it looks like the groups with worse mental health on average have experienced a bigger deterioration in their mental health over the last year. And finally, if you ask me to pick one priority, I'd focus on what was going on in our schooling system, something that Moira touched on. Obviously, all students have had a really bad year in terms of their learning, and school pupils will have lost out on 6 months roughly of face-to-face learning. That's something we normally spend about £30 billion worth of resources on. And the evidence shows that it's children from poorer backgrounds who've been doing less learning at home than children from richer backgrounds. And the evidence also shows that before last summer, when schools reopened on a voluntary basis, it was children from richer families who are more likely to take up that offer and go to school than children from poorer families. So there's some big lessons there for government in how schools are reopened now. And then just finally, I want to touch on sustainable funding. There's been lots of discussions of tax rises that certainly aren't needed now, but almost certainly will be needed at some point. I agree with David that there's certainly a role for looking at our capital taxes, for improving them and getting more money from them. I agree with Moira, there's an opportunity to increase alcohol taxes. And in fact, Brexit gives us an opportunity to make our alcohol taxes work better, because we're no longer constrained in which the way in which we tax alcohol. We can now focus our taxes on alcohol much better than we could when we were members of the European Union. But I think I'd also like to stress that actually, if we are looking at a substantial, sustained increase in the size of the state, then actually at some point, I think it's going to involve some broad-based tax rises. It's going to be not just those who are very well off who are going to be paying more, it'll be those on average incomes too. So perhaps that could be the solidarity tax rise that Tania spoke of. To coin a phrase, it may well be that what we will need is tax rises for the many, not just the few. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carl. Well, a lot to think about there. We do have a lot of questions have emerged, I see in the Q&A. Keris, perhaps you could moderate some of this.
Yes, of course. So helpfully, a lot of the authors of the papers have been typing some replies. So if you have asked a question, you might be able to find it's already been answered in the answered questions section. There are a few questions for the whole panel. So firstly, from David Beck, in the frame of building back better, should a new post-COVID structure of sustainable approaches to work, employment and life include a universal basic income? To me, a universal basic income seems to be a new iteration of Beveridge. Lots of votes for that particular question. We also have a question from Raj Patel. Does sustainability also depend on looking beyond public finances and also focusing on institutions that matter across the life course? For example, families in early years, employers during working life, and community during later life. And the last question we'll ask for now, this relates to David's proposal for social care funding, which Tania might also wish to respond to. And this question comes from Fran Bennett. Why should the costs of social care be allowed to lie where they fall, rather than this being shared by all the better off by changing capital taxation generally, as also suggested?
Thank you. Maybe we'll, there's a lot of questions about UBI, and I think we'd quite like to hear from a number of members of the panel about the UBI question. So I'll postpone that for the moment. Let us start with the social care funding question. Tania, do you have some views on that?
Yes, thanks. And thanks, Fran, for the question. So the DILMOT proposals that David Willetts referred to in his remarks largely address the inequity between those who have the misfortune to need a long period of care and those who have the good fortune not to, but who have a modest or higher level of wealth. That's principally what the DILMOT proposals would address. And that's certainly an important form of inequity about the current way in which social care funding works. My doubt, however, is that that will be sufficient to increase the amount of resources available to social care, which our analysis suggests is the overriding priority within social care, a basic problem of inadequacy. So Polly put up the figures on unmet need, which is up to about 40%. and higher in the most deprived areas for the over 65, for example. So increasing the total volume of resources available to social care, it seems to me, is as important, if not more important, than addressing inequities between those who currently are obliged to pay and those who have the good fortune not to need to. Both need to be tackled, but I think the priority is in overall resources. And for that, I agree with Fran that we need something that doesn't just depend on the contributions of those who happen to need social care, but is from broader based tax funding, for example, following some of the suggestions that Carl has made. You're muted, Julian.
No. Thank you, Tania. Okay. Anyone else on the panel want to think about social care? Any point anyone would like to make?
Julian, as Fran's comment arose from something I'd said, perhaps I could make a quick comment.
Indeed.
Of course, well-designed capital taxes we're going to need anyway. Extra public spending on social care, very likely. But I'm looking around for money anywhere and everywhere to fund what I think is clearly a more expensive set of public and private services. And at least with social care, there is currently some private payment. And my view is, if you have currently got some payment, and you have got, thanks to Andrew Dilnot's proposals, I think a viable scheme for getting some people, even if it is after death from their estate, to make a contribution to it, given all the other funding pressures, saying all of those costs are now going to be socialized via general taxation is an unnecessary step. Perhaps in more normal times, one would have gone for a different approach. But my view is whatever taxes Fran thinks she wants to raise on capital through capital, and whatever other ones Carl has got in mind, we're probably going to need those anyway. So if we can legitimately collect some money from people who can afford it out of their estates, we should do so.
Thank you very much, David. Keris, the second question concerned the life course. Who did you think was most appropriate to?
Yes, so this is a general question which any member of the panel might want to answer. So it wasn't directed at a particular response or presentation. So this was about, in terms of sustainability, does it depend on looking beyond public finances and focusing on institutions that matter across the life course? So that could relate to a number of different institutions. So employers during working life, for example.
Does anybody wish to come back on that? What sort of institutions do you think that is? Who is the questioner? Who is the questioner on that?
So to see who asked the question?
Yes.
Yes, so this question was from Raj Patel, and it covers families in early years, so it's related to early years as well, employers during working life, and community during later life.
Can you hear me? Can I just clarify that question? Maybe that might help.
Yep.
Yes.
So I'm thinking here about the fact that often in these discussions, we tend to think about public services and investing in health services or schools. And in fact, what that means is that often it's quite easy for a government to reduce spending in some of those areas if things get harder. But if you try and look at institutions, and I use the word institutions in a very loose way, how can you strengthen families? How can you have employers playing a bigger role in delivering or tackling inequalities or delivering social value, I guess, in that sense, that kind of gets built into the marketplace? Or how can you strengthen communities, as we found during the early phases of COVID, that a lot of organizations who were able to respond quite quickly were coming from local initiatives rather than the health service itself or Public Health England or whatever it may be. So there are clearly a wide range of institutions that touch on people's lives. And how could we be looking at that rather than the traditional issue about, well, it's schools or hospitals?
I see. So it's moving away from the conventional welfare state institutions to thinking about other institutions in the community that could actually help with some of the problems identified. Does anybody wish to, Minouche, I can see, yes.
I guess I would call what you're speaking about, Raj, as the kind of wider social contract, which includes families, the market, private insurance, etc., which all deliver parts of the safety net, as distinct from the welfare state. And, you know, I think we can look at those as provide, you know, think about care, how a high proportion of care is provided by families and communities instead of by the welfare state. I guess the way I would think about it, and I also agree with what I think is implicit in your question, is that employers have gotten off pretty lightly lately by not having to pay, for example, benefits to flexible workers. And I think that needs a bit of rebalancing. And if you're a flexible worker and you work 25% of the time, you should get benefits in proportion to 25%, and they should be paying for national insurance and all those things that are required of all employers. But I guess how I think about it is that we need to think of the welfare state just guaranteeing there's a minimum for everybody, a minimum in terms of old age care, a minimum in terms of early years, that's there as a possibility to make sure that the floor on people's welfare is protected. And then these other institutions are on top, is kind of how I would think about it. But Moira, I think Moira also had a thought on this.
Thank you very much, Minouche. Yes, Moira.
Yeah, I was, Raj, I thought that was a really interesting suggestion. And I was thinking as I was pondering the educational catch-up plan, how much can be offered at local level if people just know who to offer it to? So if in order to catch up for lost learning, there are going to have to be more classes with more teachers, more teaching assistants, then think of all the sadly now empty premises in towns up and down the country that could be used. All the people who actually, you know, have been on furlough, have not been able to do anything for their income, who would love to volunteer. I think, you know, to be teaching assistants and so on. If we actually do some of these things more locally, there are all sorts of resources that can be harnessed, and that has multiple benefits. And actually, I think that's one of the things that's gone very well with the vaccine program, in that it has been done, the resources and the vaccines have been provided nationally, they've been delivered locally, and that has enabled people to be harnessed as volunteers and things to be in the right place. If we do things more locally, then some of those institutions will function better. This can't be done by national government. It needs to be organised locally.
Thank you, Moira. I'm afraid we're coming up for the last few minutes, and there's a big discussion in the chat, in the Q&A, about UBI, Universal Basic Income. I don't think we've got time to address it, so I think it'll have to be addressed properly in the responses to the Q&A that we are going to post later. I think I must now turn to Frances Cairncross to a few concluding remarks. I didn't introduce her properly when at an earlier stage, so let me just repeat that she is a very distinguished economic journalist. She's worked as an economic columnist in The Guardian, Britain editor on The Economist itself. She was head of Exeter College at Oxford and chair of the course of Heriot Watt. And she chaired the executive committee of the IFS and is still a member of the IFS Council. And I think she chaired the advisory board on this research project. Frances, over to you.
Yes, that's the reason I'm here, Julian, is because I chaired the advisory board, and it was a fantastically distinguished and helpful group. You've heard today from two members of it, from David Willetts and Carl Emmerson, and so you all have some idea of the calibre of the discussion that took place. And I'd also like to thank Nuffield itself, Nuffield Foundation, for having put that in place. I think it must have been probably very useful to the academics involved to have that quality of challenge and suggestion and advice with the work that they did. Secondly, I want to thank on behalf of the advisory board, the people, particularly from LSE, who really made this report happen. And Polly Vizard really deserves an enormous round of applause from all of us. She lived with the decline in John's health, John's availability, and ultimately with having to pull the whole thing together at the end with the help of particularly of Tania. And this would really not have happened, I think, in the way it has, the very clear, crisp, useful way that this report has now emerged. Without their work, it's been absolutely invaluable. So thank you, both of you. It's a report that sketches out a very difficult 5 years, and the next 5 years are clearly not going to be any easier than that has been. And I think in spite of David's very interesting take on it, on the whole, the picture that we get is one of opportunities missed and of roads not followed. It would have been very nice to see some of the suggestions that we've just heard in the last 20 minutes put in place 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I think for me, there are 2 or 3 things that come out of it. One is the sheer complexity of the system, how difficult it is to push the right buttons and to get the right responses emerging, and the dangers of making, of tinkering with the overall structure. I think of that particularly in the case of child benefit and the poverty that has been inflicted on larger families by having a benefit system that cuts off after child number 2. And overall, I think the penalties that have been imposed, particularly on younger children, the failure to see the resources there grow as they have for some other sectors of the economy, is really a tremendous mistake. What we should be doing is, I think, pumping resources into the under 5s particularly, because that's the stage at which so much of people's intellectual, emotional, physical inheritance is built. What we've seen has been a shift in resources largely to the elderly, away from the very young. The triple lock has done its stuff. I think a triple lock on child benefit might have been a better investment. And we are going to have to find some way to escape from this trap of the triple lock that successive governments have got themselves into. But we also need to tackle the area of adult social care. And I thought, for me, one of the most interesting points was the rise in youngsters applying for now non-existent jobs in retailing, but not applying for the jobs that are so necessary in social care. Getting social care right is a challenge which this government really mustn't fail at. So this has been a huge portrait of social services, of social benefits, of which things we've got right and the other things that we've got wrong. I think that it's going to be extremely important that policymakers take the chance to look at this as we emerge from, as I hope we will, from the COVID year, and as we try to build back better. This is a roadmap of what not to do and what we can do and what we could achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frances, and masterly summing up of some of the major issues that were involved. Well, I fear we are now running out of time. I would just like to echo Frances's tribute to the researchers who've been involved in this, to Polly particularly, and Tania for the work that we've done, but also the rest of the team. It has been a massive project and with some very impressive outcomes. I think we should also refer back to something that Minouche mentioned right at the beginning. This is the Beverage 2.0 initiative that in some senses, the whole experience of the COVID pandemic gives increased momentum too. There is maybe, as some or one of, I think it was one of Bill Clinton's advisors said, never let a good crisis go to waste. We do have an opportunity here for some radical rethinking of the welfare state. And indeed of other, as Raj Patel mentioned, of the other institutions that can contribute to welfare. And maybe this is something of an opportunity we should all see, and building on the work of this particular project, but also on the major contributions that our speakers have all provided with. So I would just like to finish then by a major thank you to our speakers for the contributions they've made. I've got a sheaf of notes here that I was hoping to be able to talk about, but will not be able to. However, the debate will continue. As I say, in the Q&A, there will be some responses to some of the points made, particularly about, hopefully about UBI. But in the meantime, I think now that we are actually moving perhaps into a more positive situation with respect to the pandemic, this is an opportunity to take things forward and develop what we would like to all see, which is a better, juster, fairer, and more prosperous welfare economy. So thank you all very much.